remember the way the air felt that morning, thick, heavy, like it was carrying secrets that didn't belong in daylight. The sky was gray, not crying yet, but waiting to. You could smell rain hiding somewhere close. I stood at the edge of the church steps in a black dress that fit too perfectly for a day that felt so wrong, my gloved hands clutching a folded handkerchief that hadn't done a single thing to stop my tears. They called it a funeral, but it felt more like a performance. Every seat filled, every whisper rehearsed, every tear selective. I watched the people file in, family, friends, the curious ones, the ones who came just to see how I'd hold myself now that my husband was gone. And I did hold myself tight because if I didn't, I might have shattered. But grief isn't something you wear quietly. It leaks through the cracks even when you smile. The choir sang soft hymns that crawled up the walls and pressed against the ceiling, their notes trembling like they were afraid of the truth sitting in that coffin. I didn't look at him for the first half hour. I just listened to the murmurs, to the small talk disguised as sympathy, and every word felt like a blade turned sideways in my chest. I'd spent years standing beside that man, learning the shape of his silence, memorizing the temperature of his moods, and still, in the last year of his life, I didn't know who he really was. I guess part of me didn't want to. When I finally lifted my eyes to the casket, it felt like staring into a lie carved in wood. They had him dressed in a suit I didn't pick. His hands folded like prayer, even though he hadn't prayed in years. His hair was combed back too smooth, like he was still trying to look like the man people thought he was. My husband, Michael. The man everyone said was devoted, charming, successful. The man who used to kiss me on the forehead every morning before work and tell me I was his peace. I used to believe that. Until peace started feeling like a word that meant, don't ask questions. The preacher's voice echoed, smooth and slow, reading verses about eternal rest, but I didn't hear God in any of it. I heard echoes of the fights that ended with slammed doors and his cologne disappearing for days. I heard the way he used to say you wouldn't understand whenever I asked about his business trips. I heard the phone calls he took in the garage, the ones that always ended when I walked in. The woman I used to be died long before he did. But none of that prepared me for her. It was near the end of the service when she came in, late, quiet, dressed in a black dress that shimmered faintly when the light hit it. Her face was calm, almost too calm, like she wasn't mourning but remembering. She didn't sit with the rest of the crowd. She stood near the back, hands folded, head slightly bowed. And when the final prayer ended and people began to rise, she walked straight down the aisle, her heels clicking like a countdown. No one stopped her. I didn't either. I just watched. She reached the coffin with a kind of grace that didn't belong in grief. In her hand she held a single red rose. It wasn't the usual funeral flower. Not white, not lily, but red, alive, deliberate. She leaned over him, brushed something invisible from his lapel, and then, without looking around, placed the rose on his chest. And then I saw her lips move. She didn't whisper loud enough for anyone else to hear. But I was close enough. I saw the shape of the words form against her breath. See you tonight. And just like that, she turned and left. The room didn't react. No one else caught it, no one else saw, but something in me cracked open like glass under heat. The air went colder. The light dimmed in my head. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared at the rose resting on his still chest. Its color too bold, too alive for death. For a long time after the burial, those 3 words haunted me. See you tonight. I tried to tell myself it meant nothing, maybe some poetic goodbye, something women say to men they once loved. But the way she said it, it wasn't goodbye. It was a promise. That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt foreign, like it had been rearranged while I was gone. His clothes still hung in the closet. His scent still clung to the air. That faint trace of cedar and cologne that used to make me feel safe. Now it just made me sick. Every tick of the clock felt too loud. Midnight came and went, and still I lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling. It was around 1:13 a.m. when I heard it. The front door creaked. Not opened, not closed, just moved, like someone testing it. I told myself it was the wind, but the windows were shut tight. Then came the faintest shuffle, the soft sound of shoes against the hallway floor. My pulse stuttered. I reached for the lamp but stopped halfway. Something deep in me said, asterisk, don't move. Just listen. Asterisk, the footsteps stopped outside my bedroom. Silence stretched so thin it felt like it would snap. I could hear my heartbeat echoing in my ears. Then came the sound that turned my blood to ice, a low familiar hum. Not a voice. A tune. One he used to hum when he was shaving, the one I used to tease him about for years. I sat up. The room was dark except for the weak glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. My breath caught when I saw it, just faint enough to doubt but clear enough to freeze me. A shadow. Tall. Standing right outside the bedroom door. I blinked. It was gone. But on the floor just beneath the crack of the door was something small and dark. I reached for it with shaking hands. When my fingers touched it, the scent hit me before my eyes confirmed it. A rose petal. Fresh. Red. That was the first night. By morning, I convinced myself it was grief, exhaustion, maybe even imagination. People see things when they lose someone, they say it's the mind's way of coping. I tried to believe that. But when I went downstairs, I saw muddy footprints on the marble floor leading from the front door to the staircase. They were too big to be mine. The next few days blurred together. Condolences, casseroles, phone calls, silence. But the nights, those were alive. I started hearing things that didn't belong in a quiet house. Whispers too close to my ear, the faint sound of running water in the bathroom when no one was there. The TV flicking on by itself at 3 a.m. once, playing static so loud it made my teeth ache. And always that smell. Roses. Faint, sweet, and wrong. Then one evening, as I was pouring myself a drink, the doorbell rang. I didn't want visitors, but something made me open it. It was her. The woman from the funeral. She stood there calm as ever, holding a black umbrella. Her eyes sharp but kind in a way that felt practiced. She introduced herself with a name that didn't fit her, Elena. She said she wanted to talk, that she had known my husband for years, that she just wanted closure. Something inside me wanted to slam the door. But another part, the one that had been itching with unanswered questions, let her in. Her perfume filled the house immediately, soft, floral, heavy with that same rose scent. She sat down in Michael's favorite chair without asking. Her hand brushed the armrest like she knew its texture. I sat across from her, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. She started talking about him, casual at first, stories that didn't match mine, moments I wasn't there for. She laughed once, soft, nostalgic. I didn't join her. When she noticed I wasn't responding, she leaned forward, eyes dark and glassy. "He used to talk about you," she said. "Said you were the only thing he couldn't fix." Those words landed like ice. I didn't know what she meant. Before I could ask, she reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph. It was of Michael, smiling, standing beside her, his arm around her waist. And behind them, our house. That was the moment I realized the woman who whispered, "See you tonight," wasn't mourning him. She was waiting for me. I stared at the photograph so long that the edges started to blur. He looked happy in it, the kind of happiness that used to make me believe we were untouchable. But now that same smile felt rehearsed, like he'd been practicing for 2 lives at once. Elena watched me carefully, waiting for my reaction, the way a person waits to see if a wound will bleed. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but none of them would have mattered. She was already telling me the answer just by sitting there in that chair, in my house, wearing that calm-like perfume. My husband had built another world, and she'd been living in it. I set the picture on the table face down, but the image didn't leave me. It burned through the wood, through the air, until it was all I could see. She said softly that she hadn't come to cause pain, only to return something that didn't belong to her. From her purse she pulled a small velvet box. Inside was a gold band, simple, familiar, the twin of the ring that still circled my own finger. She said he'd told her it belonged to no one, that he'd never truly been married. The words settled between us like dust after an explosion. I should have thrown her out. I should have screamed. But instead I asked her a single question. "When did he give it to you?" She said last winter. And that was when the chill in my spine turned to something colder. Last winter was when he'd told me he was overseas for work, sending me postcards from places he'd never been. My heart didn't break in that moment. It simply stopped recognizing itself. She left soon after, slipping out into the drizzle without another word. The door closed softly behind her, but the scent of roses stayed long after she was gone. I sat there until the rain started tapping against the windows, and then I rose and walked through the house like a stranger wandering through a museum of someone else's life. Every photograph on the wall was a lie, every letter on his desk a fragment of a story he'd rewritten. That night I dreamed I was standing at the cemetery again. The grass was brighter, the sky darker, and I could hear water running somewhere underground. A single rose lay on the grave, but it wasn't fresh anymore. It was dried, brittle, gray around the edges. When I bent to touch it, the stem broke in half, and from the crack came a whisper. "You were never meant to be the wife." I woke with that sentence still echoing in my chest. Days passed, slow and sticky, each one pulling me deeper into questions that wouldn't rest. I looked for Elena, for any trace of her, but she'd vanished as if she'd never existed. No phone number, no address, not even a name that fit. I even called the funeral home, asked if she'd signed the guest book. She hadn't. It was as if she'd walked out of the dark and melted back into it. I told myself to let it go, to bury the curiosity along with him. But grief has its own kind of gravity. Keeps pulling until you give in. One afternoon I drove to his office downtown. The receptionist looked surprised to see me, and even more surprised when I asked for his files. She said most of his things had been cleared out the week after he died, by his assistant. The name on the clearance form made my breath catch. Elena Ward. So it was real. I spent the next hours combing through what was left. Ledgers, invoices, half-finished projects. Buried beneath a stack of papers was an envelope addressed to no one. Inside were photographs, more of them. Michael with Elena at dinners at hotels, at a small cottage by a lake I'd never seen. In one photo, his wedding ring was missing. In another, she was wearing it. Something inside me changed that day. It wasn't rage yet. It was the quiet before rage. The silence that comes when you stop expecting answers. I drove home with the windows down, the cold air slicing through the fog of my thoughts. When I reached the house, dusk had already settled in, painting the walls with that blue-gray light that makes everything look half alive. The moment I stepped inside, the smell returned. Roses, strong this time, too strong to be imagination. I followed it through the hall and into the living room. There, on the table where the first rose had rested in the coffin, lay another one. Fresh. Crimson. Dew still clinging to its petals though it hadn't rained all day. I didn't scream. I just stared at it, then slowly picked it up. A small tag was tied to the stem with black thread. On it, written in neat handwriting I recognized immediately, were 3 words. "We're not done." The air thickened around me, heavy as a heartbeat. I placed the rose back down, stepped away, and sat in the chair opposite, watching it like it might speak again. Maybe she'd been here while I was gone. Maybe she'd kept a key. Maybe she wanted me to know she wasn't finished telling her side. That night I waited. Every light in the house stayed off. Midnight crept closer, the clock ticking slow and deliberate. At 12:01 the doorbell rang once, soft but sure. I didn't move right away. I just let the sound settle into the walls. Then I walked to the door and opened it. No one was there. Only the scent of wet flowers drifting in from the garden. I stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin. Across the street, a car idled for a moment, its headlights cutting through the mist, and then it pulled away. When I looked down, there was something on the welcome mat. A small box, the same velvet kind Elena had shown me before. Inside wasn't a ring this time. It was a key. I didn't know what it opened, but I knew it wasn't the end. From that night on, I stopped being afraid of what I didn't know. I started listening to the house, to the creaks that carried meaning, to the silence that hummed like a warning. I gathered every trace of him I could find and began piecing together the truth he'd left scattered behind. And with each piece I felt something inside me growing. Not forgiveness, not peace, but clarity. People like to say the dead can't hurt you. They're wrong. It's not the dead who haunt you. It's the lies they leave behind. And I knew then that whatever waited for me at the end of this trail of roses would not be a ghost. It would be the truth, alive and breathing, waiting for me to open the right door. The key sat on my bedside table for 2 nights before I could bring myself to touch it again. It was small, brass, and worn at the edges, the kind that belonged to a door that hadn't been opened in years. Each morning I would wake and see it glinting in the thin light, quiet, patient, daring me to remember what I was afraid of. On the 3rd morning I slid it into my pocket and left the house without breakfast, driving with no direction, trusting that my hands on the wheel would know before my head did. The city was still damp from the rain, streets shining like mirrors. I stopped at a locksmith, pretending I'd found the key in an old box. He studied it through a magnifier and said it looked like one used for storage units, the kind built 20 years ago, not made anymore. Something about that felt right. Michael had always liked keeping things in places where no one thought to look. I found the number of every storage facility in the county and started calling. On the fifth call, a woman told me a unit under Michael's name still existed. Rent paid a year in advance. She asked if I was his assistant. I told her I was his wife. There was a long silence before she said, "We were wondering when someone would come." The place was out near the edge of town where the freeway met a line of warehouses, rows of metal doors painted dull green. The air smelled of dust and rain-soaked concrete. The clerk at the front desk looked at me the way people do when they don't want to get involved. She handed me a clipboard to sign and a small map marked Unit 37. The lock clicked open easily, as if it had been waiting for me. The door groaned upward and a breath of cold, stale air rolled out. Inside were boxes stacked to the ceiling, an old desk, and a single chair placed in the middle of the concrete floor. On the desk sat a cassette recorder and a stack of tapes, each labeled only with dates. I pressed play on the first tape. The static came first, then his voice, steady, casual, businesslike. He was dictating notes, listing transactions, things that sounded harmless until I listened closer. Each client he mentioned was a name I recognized from people we'd once called friends. And woven through it all was Elena's voice, faint in the background, reading numbers, reminding him of meetings. I listened to tape after tape, hours of him speaking as if his life were perfectly divided. A world of profit, of secrets, of shared language between him and the woman I'd met at my doorstep. On one tape he laughed, soft, genuine, and said her name the way he used to say mine when we were young. There was one last tape at the bottom of the stack, marked with a date 2 days before he died. When I played it, there was no business talk, just breathing, and then his voice, quieter than I'd ever heard it. He said he couldn't keep doing it, that it had gone too far, that she knows now. He never said who she was. Then came a sound, metal scraping, a door creaking, a sharp breath, and the tape ended. I sat there for a long time after the silence returned. The fluorescent light above flickered, and for a moment I could almost see the life he'd hidden here. The half-truths, the recorded pieces of himself. It wasn't grief that filled me then. It was something colder, steadier. The kind of calm that comes when confusion burns away, and only purpose remains. Before I left, I noticed another box tucked behind the desk. Inside were photographs again, but different this time. Not of her and him. Of me. Me at the grocery store, me walking the dog, me sitting on the porch reading. Dozens of them taken from a distance. Some were months old, others from just weeks before his death. In the corner of each, written in his hand, was a single number. They weren't dates. They were coordinates. By the time I drove home, the sun had started to sink, washing the sky in rust and violet. I didn't feel the road beneath me, only the rhythm of something unfolding. When I reached the house, I laid the photographs across the dining table, arranging them in the order of the numbers. It took time, but slowly a map began to form. At its center was a lake, one I'd never been to, one that matched the background of a few pictures of him and Elena together. I knew where the key belonged now. The next morning before dawn, I packed a bag and drove out to that lake. The road curved through pine trees and fog so thick it felt like driving through memory itself. The lake appeared suddenly, a mirror of pale glass, still and perfect. On its far side, half hidden by reeds, stood a cottage with white shutters. The key turned in the lock like it had done so 1,000 times before. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with the scent of roses again. Faded like the memory of perfume on old fabric. The walls were lined with photographs, none of me, all of them of him and her, smiling as if this was the world that had truly belonged to them. On the mantel stood an urn, unmarked, and beside it, a single letter addressed to me. The handwriting was his. I didn't open it right away. I sat on the floor and listened to the water outside, calm and endless, and felt the years collapse into that sound. Then I broke the seal. He wrote that the cottage was never meant to be a secret, that it had been his escape, a place to remember who he was before everything turned to ambition. He said Elena had helped him build it, that she understood parts of him I refused to see. But he also wrote that he'd lied to her too, that none of what he promised either of us was ever real. I built 2 lives, he wrote, and both are burning now. The last line was a plea. If she comes to you, tell her I kept my promise. The letter ended there, no signature. I folded it carefully, slid it back into the envelope and stood up, Through the window I could see the reflection of the cottage shimmering on the water, its image trembling with every ripple. It looked fragile, like it could dissolve at any moment. When I stepped outside, the first light of morning broke through the trees. For the first time in months I felt the weight inside me shift. Not gone but changed, reshaped into something I could carry. The past didn't need to speak anymore. It had said everything it could. As I walked toward the car, a breeze moved across the lake, carrying the faintest scent of roses. I turned once more toward the cottage and whispered, not to him, not to her, but to the silence itself. Now I know. And for the first time the silence didn't whisper back. The drive back from the lake felt unreal, like retracing the steps of a dream that had already begun to fade. The trees blurred past, the radio was off, and in the passenger seat lay the letter, folded and quiet, as if it had said everything it ever needed to. But by the time I reached the city, that calm began to unravel. The stillness of the cottage had felt final, but the world I returned to was restless. There were messages on my phone from people I hadn't heard from in months. Neighbors asking if I was okay. Reporters leaving vague voicemails about new developments in Michael's case. It seemed that even after death, he refused to stay buried. That night I couldn't sleep. The sound of rain against the windows reminded me of that recording. The faint scrape, the door creaking, his breath right before the tape cut out. I replayed it in my head until I realized something that froze me. The sound of that door wasn't metal like the storage unit. It was wood, the kind you'd find on a cottage by a lake. My chest tightened. I grabbed the letter again, holding it under the light. There was a faint watermark under the ink, barely visible but there. The logo of a law firm. One I recognized. The same firm that handled Michael's will. I called the number printed faintly at the corner of the page. A man answered, polite but cautious, and when I said Michael's name, there was a pause long enough to let me know he remembered. Yes, Mrs. Hale, he said finally. There is one sealed item left in our care. It was to be released only upon your personal request. He gave me the address. The office was on the 12th floor of an old downtown building, glass and marble, the kind of place where time moves slower. The clerk handed me a small black envelope, no return address, no markings, and said, he left instructions that you should open it alone. I waited until I was home, sitting at the same dining table where I'd once arranged his photographs. The letter inside was short, only one line written in his precise, careful script. Asterisk, if she lied to you too, look beneath the rose. Asterisk, I stared at it, every nerve in me tightening. Beneath the rose. My mind went back to that cottage, to the scent that lingered, to the urn on the mantel. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't dared. I left before dawn again, the roads wet and glimmering. The lake was exactly as I'd left it, a mirror of gray clouds. Inside, the cottage was colder now, the air still but heavy. I walked straight to the mantel and lifted the urn. It was lighter than I expected. When I tilted it, a small metal object slid out and clinked softly onto the wood. It was a locket, antique, tarnished, engraved with a rose. Inside were two tiny photographs. One was Michael. The other was Elena. Between them, pressed flat and yellowed, was a scrap of paper. I unfolded it carefully. It was a deed to a house I didn't recognize, dated years before his death, co-signed by both of them. But what chilled me wasn't the signature. It was the address. The house was on the same street where I had grown up. The edges of memory began to sharpen, painful and bright. A neighbor I hadn't thought about in years. A girl my age who'd lived 2 houses down, who used to borrow my books and follow me everywhere. Her name was Elena. I stumbled back, the room spinning. The walls seemed to close in as the truth came together in a single crushing realization. She hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. She'd been there from the beginning, watching, waiting, quietly shaping her life around mine. My phone buzzed. A message. No name, no number. Just a single line. You finally understand. The phone slipped from my hand. I turned toward the window. Across the lake at the edge of the trees, someone stood watching, still small against the gray dawn. The same silhouette I'd seen in the reflection once before. I didn't move. I didn't scream. I just watched as she slowly raised her hand, almost in greeting, before stepping back into the mist until she was gone. By the time I reached the shore, there were only footprints, small, leading into the water, fading where the waves lapped the sand. I waited for her to emerge, for the shape to return, but the lake stayed still, rippling only where the wind brushed across it. I should have felt terror. Or relief. But what came instead was a kind of clarity, terrible precise clarity. She hadn't come for me. She'd come to finish what he started. The letter, the key, the storage unit, it had all been designed to lead me here, to make me see them as they saw themselves. Not lovers, not conspirators, but architects of something that began long before I understood. And now I was part of it too. When I left the lake this time, I didn't look back. I drove until the signal returned, until the gray light of morning became afternoon. I stopped at a small motel and checked in under a name that wasn't mine. That night, I laid everything out on the bed. The key, the letter, the locket, the photographs. I took a match from the bedside drawer, lit it, and watched the flame eat through them one by one. The smoke rose slow and steady, curling like breath, until all that remained was ash and silence. For a moment I thought I saw her again, reflected in the window standing behind me, her eyes calm and unblinking. But when I turned there was no one there, only the faint scent of roses. I smiled then, not from peace, but from understanding. Because some hauntings don't come from ghosts. They come from the truths we dig up when we finally dare to look beneath the rose. The motel room never truly went dark. Even with the lamp off, the faint orange light from the parking lot slipped through the curtains and painted everything in a quiet half-glow. I sat by the window listening to the hum of cars on the distant highway, the sound rising and falling like a heartbeat. The ashes of the letters were gone now, swept into a paper cup and flushed away. Yet their weight lingered in the air. Grief is strange that way. It burns, it disappears, and somehow it still fills the room. Morning came slow. I checked out before anyone else was awake and drove with no destination in mind. The road wound through stretches of empty farmland and the occasional gas station that looked as tired as I felt. I should have felt free, unburdened, but freedom has a silence that can be louder than guilt. Somewhere between one small town and the next I saw it. A florist by the roadside, its sign faded, a single rose painted on wood. I don't remember pulling over, only standing inside, surrounded by the smell of soil and petals and something older. The woman behind the counter didn't ask what I wanted. She just looked at me and said, "You've come for the white ones." Her voice wasn't Elena's, yet it carried the same kind of certainty, the kind that makes you feel seen in ways you never asked to be. I nodded without knowing why. She wrapped the rose in brown paper, tied it with twine and whispered, "Every promise leaves a shadow." I carried it back to the car, placed it carefully on the passenger seat, and drove toward the address on that old deed, the house that had once been near where I grew up. I didn't plan to stop. I only wanted to see it to know if it was real. But when I reached the end of that street, the house stood there exactly as my memory had built it, paint peeling, windows shuttered, the porch sagging slightly under its own age. The key from the storage unit still hung around my neck. Out of habit, I tried it in the lock. It turned. Inside smelled of dust and rain-soaked wood. The rooms were mostly empty except for the faint outlines of furniture that had been moved long ago. In the center of the living room stood a table, and on it a single photograph, Michael and Elena, smiling at something beyond the frame. But behind them, almost hidden in the blur, was another figure. Me. A reflection caught in a window. Watching. My breath caught. The image wasn't from a time I remembered, yet the face was unmistakably mine. I set the rose beside it, and for the first time since the funeral I spoke aloud. "You wanted me to see." The air seemed to shift, as though the house itself exhaled. The curtains trembled though no wind passed. I could have sworn I heard footsteps on the porch, slow and familiar. But when I turned, the doorway was empty, only light spilling across the floor. I stayed there a long time, until the sound faded and the quiet returned, heavier but gentler somehow. When I finally left, I didn't take the photo. I left the rose where it was, its stem resting across the faces that had once stolen every version of my life. By the time I reached the road again, the sky had turned the color of bruised violets. I looked back once, and for a moment in the upstairs window, I thought I saw a figure watching, tall, still, framed by the fading light. Whether it was Elena or Michael or the echo of who I used to be, I couldn't tell. That night, I rented another room in another nameless town. I opened the curtains wide and let the moonlight flood in. For the first time in months, I slept deeply, dreamlessly. In the morning, I woke to find a single petal on the pillow beside me, white, soft, and carrying the faintest trace of a familiar perfume. I didn't flinch. I simply smiled, folded it into my hand, and whispered, "See you tonight."